Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of the Fantasy Fellowshow. I am your host, the fellow KGB. Today, we're going to be covering the NFC North. We're going to start with the Chicago Bears. We'll take a peek at the depth chart. We'll take a look at who they drafted, who they added and lost in free agency, and we'll kind of just paint the picture as to which Chicago Bears we're going to be interested in drafting for this upcoming season. So Matt Nagy and Bill Lazor are back together for another season. It's Bill Lazor's second season with the team, Matt Nagy's fourth, so some continuity there. We'll skip the depth chart for now. We'll come back to that in a little bit. I want to look at the draft class first because this is probably one of the most important things about the Chicago Bears this season and probably the next handful of years. They moved up in the first round to take Justin Fields at number 11 overall. They did sign Andy Dalton, who we'll talk about in a little bit here, but the move to go get Justin Fields pretty much guarantees Matt Nagy and the GM there. I can't remember the GM's name, but it gives them more time, essentially. They kind of patched their fix with Mitch Trubisky. They got rid of him. He's at Buffalo now. And now comes Justin Fields. And it sounds like it's going to be a potential Andy Dalton gets the ceremonial, maybe first few games to start the year, but Justin Fields should be able to get on the field at some point this season. So it's really exciting for Chicago Bears fans. And we'll see what Justin Fields can do. He's got a couple good weapons for him, a solid running game, a solid offensive line. They also moved, they got it up in the second to get Tevin Jenkins out of Oklahoma State. So I think people are really ecstatic about this start. They come back with I guess they took the rounds 3 and 4 off. They kind of made their moves and had to get what they got. But they ended up with a 5th round pick offensive tackle out of Missouri, running back Khalil Herbert out of Virginia Tech, wide receiver Daz Newsome out of North Carolina, cornerback in the 6th round here, Thomas Graham from Oregon, and then a defensive tackle, Khyiris Tonga from BYU. But you love the offensive identity of this draft. You get a quarterback for the future, starting left tackle for the future, potential depth tackle, a running back, and a wide receiver for extra depth. So I like that they built a little solid core around Justin Fields. They're going to prop him up a little bit with this offensive draft here. Now let's move on to the notable additions. Of course, Andy Dalton's at the top of the list. Jeremiah Atachu, linebacking. Angelo Blackson, defensive end. They did add a couple of receivers, Marquise Goodwin, Damiere Byrd, and they also kind of sneakily signed Damian Williams from Kansas City. He actually had the year off last year from the COVID, and he's now he's going to be hanging out with Chicago. Notable departures, Roy Robertson Harris, Kyle Fuller, Charles Leno, Cordero Patterson, and Mitch Trubisky. So these are some pretty big names that they lost here, but as we see here, they did sign pretty much everything but cornerback, and then they did draft a offensive tackle for them. So significant losses, but some significant additions as well. None bigger than Justin Fields and Tevin Jenkins. So I love these first 2 picks, and with that, we'll look into the depth chart here. Of course, I typically do this as the quarterback. You see here the Andy Dalton and Justin Fields are both in bold. Blue players are drafted, green players are undrafted. So they plugged in 3 offensive players in this draft, which I think is pretty nice. You're going to have Andy Dalton and Justin Fields at the top. Now, I think before we get any deeper, let me look at the Chicago Bears schedule because we're assuming Andy Dalton they're going to give him the option, to get to win the job. I just don't see him keeping it very long, but it really depends on this Bears schedule. If they get off to a rocky start, perhaps they turn to Justin Fields. But game 1 against Los Angeles, that's going to be a tough game. Cincinnati is a winnable game. Cleveland's going to be a tough game. Detroit's a winnable game. So I'm seeing kind of a worst case scenario. They're 2-2 coming out of week 4 here. Las Vegas is kind of a 50-50 game. Green Bay, we'll see what happens with Aaron Rodgers, but for now, that's a 50-50 game. Tampa Bay, that's a tough game. San Francisco, that's a tough game. And Pittsburgh, that's a tough game. But things kind of look a little bit better after the bye week. You get Baltimore, Detroit, Arizona, Green Bay, Minnesota, Seattle, New York, and Minnesota. So perhaps maybe towards the middle of the season, we see Justin Fields get in there, but it really depends if Andy Dalton gets off to a hot start. If he can get them, halfway through the season with a winnable record, we might see Andy Dalton kind of get pushed along as the season. But for now, I'm kind of doing just a 50-50 split. Andy Dalton, Justin Fields. We'll see how Andy Dalton does, or maybe Justin Fields beats him outright in training camp, and they just kind of hold Andy Dalton as a potential backup emergency quarterback in case of emergency kind of thing. And then they still got Nick Foles there, so he's kind of the third man, but it's all about Dalton, maybe the beginning of the starting the beginning of the year, and then you get Justin Fields when things need a little boost. For running backs, you got David Montgomery, of course, backups Tariq Cohen, Damian Williams, who we talked about in the free agency, Khalil Herbert in the 6th round, Ryan Nall, Artavis Pierce are back, and then CJ Marable was a UDFA. So I really like this group. They added Damian Williams and Khalil Herbert, really good backups here. Khalil Herbert's a really fun running back in the 6th round out of Virginia Tech. Tariq Cohen's going to be back and healthy this year. So the running back room has become kind of a moment of strength here, where in the past they've only really had one running back. Tariq Cohen's been hurt the last couple of years. They've been pretty shallow at the running back position, but they're looking much stronger now. For David Montgomery, I love getting David Montgomery. I know he's probably going to lose a little bit of passing work to Tariq Cohen, maybe even to Damian Williams. So I think his receiving numbers are not likely to be where they were last year, but his rushing numbers, we should expect him to get the ball a ton. Last season, 247 rushing attempts, 1,070 yards, 8 touchdowns. And then the receiving workload was just massive because no Tariq Cohen. So 54 catches on 68 targets, 438 yards, and 2 touchdowns. I would assume those numbers are going to come down maybe 15 to 20%, but you're still looking at roughly 250 carries, over 1,000 yards. And again, he's going to be up there in the 7, 8, 9, 10 touchdown range. So I love David Montgomery. He's a really solid running back too for us. Just looking at that schedule again, Los Angeles is going to be tough, but you can run against Cincinnati. We'll see about Cleveland, but Detroit, Las Vegas, Green Bay, some really nice games to start the running game for the season. Tariq Cohen, Damian Williams, we're not worrying about anybody else besides Montgomery for the running backs. Now with the receivers, it's going to be all about Allen Robinson. So if we look and see where A-Rob finished last year, now keep in mind, this was Mitch Trubisky, Nick Foles-led offense. Allen Robinson still finished wide receiver 9, 102 receptions, 1,250 yards, 6 TDs. He's going to get this target volume again, and he's getting better quarterback play, whether it's Andy Dalton for the first 4 or 5 games, maybe more, or it turns to Justin Fields. He's going to be peppered with targets again, so I still have him as a wide receiver 1. If you can get him somewhere in the 3rd round, I think that's appropriate value. So I love Allen Robinson this season. Anthony Miller, Darnell, Mooney. I should probably move Mooney to their number 2. He was he had more snaps last year, more targets, more everything than Anthony Miller. So we kind of hopped him. And I just think with Andy Dalton and Justin Fields having a little bit better of a deep ball accuracy, we should see Mooney start to hit some of those long passes that Trubisky and Foles were not hitting on. So I like Mooney. He's more of a sleeper, more of a project for dynasty leagues. We'll see if he's relevant for redraft. But for now, so far, I guess it's all about Montgomery and Allen Robinson. The backups here, Damiere Byrd, Javon Wims, Riley Ridley, Daz Newsome out of North Carolina in the 6th round. He's a shifty little slot receiver. Reggie Davis, Rodney Adams, Jester Weah, Marquise Goodwin, and Thomas Ives. Now the tight end position is going to be a little interesting. Jimmy Graham's another year older, and Cole Kmet started to outsnap him down the stretch last season. So I should actually list Cole Kmet as the 1A here. Jimmy Graham is the 2. It's probably going to be a lot of 2 tight end sets. The Bears used their tight ends a lot last year. Let's see, 76 targets for Graham and 44 for Cole Kmet. That's 120 total targets between the 2, 10 total touchdowns, almost 700 yards, and 78 catches. So there's a lot of work to go between the 2. It might be a little bit menacing because I think they're going to kind of eat into each other's numbers, but I really like Cole Kmet. If you want to grab him as your tight end 2, I think that's totally doable for this year. And again, he was already starting to pull away from Jimmy Graham at the end of last season. So it wouldn't surprise me if Cole Kmet's just entrenched as the 1A as soon as this year, and we'll see if Andy Dalton and Justin Fields can get a good rep with him. So I'm very excited about Cole Kmet for dynasty leagues, and I think he might be streamable, kind of a low-end option in like 12-team redrafts this year. So the backups there, J.P. Holtz, Darian Clark, and Jesper Horsted. So that's the depth chart. As far as guys that I'm drafting for redraft this year, it's David Montgomery and Allen Robinson. For Dynasty, I still love Cole Kmet. I like Darnell Mooney quite a bit. We'll see where Allen Robinson goes in the future, but he might stick around now if he gets a good connection with Justin Fields. So if you're playing in Superflex leagues, maybe snag Justin Fields really late as one of your last picks. I don't think the draft equity is going to be too high for him, so I'm into that. But otherwise, we'll kind of avoid these quarterbacks for redraft. If you can snag Justin Fields at some point during the regular season off the waiver wire, that would work, but it's all about Montgomery and Allen Robinson. So before we get out of here, though, I just want to show you guys the numbers that I got so far. Now, it's tough to do projections when you don't know who's playing and how many games. So I think what I did here is I gave Andy Dalton maybe 4 games which I'm going to have to probably, I don't know, we'll see how training camp goes, but I'm open to changing it. So I gave Dalton about 3.5 to 4 games of starting and Justin Fields the rest. But the numbers that we care about, David Montgomery comes in at almost 1,100 rushing yards, 7 touchdowns, 42 catches, 325 yards, and a touchdown. Allen Robinson, kind of what he did last year. I have him at 103 receptions, 1,205 yards, and 7 touchdowns. Darnell Mooney hanging out with 700 receiving yards, 4 touchdowns, 63 grabs. And then Cole Kmet, I have down here 43 catches, 465 yards, and 4 touchdowns. Keep in mind, these are just preliminary numbers. I'm gonna retool them as the season goes along, and we'll keep revisiting these later. So that's gonna do it for the Chicago Bears 2021 fantasy preview. I'm gonna move on to the Detroit Lions next. We'll cover the Packers and the Vikings tomorrow evening. So check out the other ones that I got out there too if you're interested in those. But that's it. Thanks. Peace.